9 Zeros closed in from every angle, their pilots certain of the kill. The American was alone, low on ammunition, and flying over hostile waters hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly airfield. What the Japanese pilots could not know was that the man in that Mustang cockpit had been flying for barely 6 months. He was not supposed to survive the next 90 seconds, and yet, somewhere in the chaos of that February sky, something shifted. The hunter became the hunted, and across Japanese radio frequencies, a single word began to repeat. The Pacific Theater in early 1945 was a graveyard of assumptions. For 3 years, American strategists had believed that victory over Japan would require methodical island hopping, overwhelming logistics, and an eventual invasion of the home islands. The atomic bomb was still months away from existence, let alone deployment. In the meantime, the war would be decided in the air. By February of that year, the United States Army Air Forces had fundamentally altered the geometry of the Pacific conflict. The capture of the Mariana Islands in mid-1944 had given American bombers access to Japan itself. B-29 superfortresses now struck Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya with growing regularity, but these massive raids came at a cost. Japanese interceptors, though outnumbered and often outclassed, still exacted a toll on unescorted bombers. The B-29 was fast and flew high, but it was not invincible. Flak and fighters brought down dozens of aircraft in the opening months of the strategic campaign. Crews bailed out over open ocean or enemy territory. Search and rescue operations stretched thin. The solution, in theory, was escort fighters. But the Pacific was not Europe. The distances were staggering. From Iwo Jima to Tokyo was nearly 700 miles, a round trip that pushed even the longest-legged fighters to their mechanical limits. The P-51 Mustang, with its internal fuel capacity and provisions for external drop tanks, was the only American fighter capable of making the journey and still having enough fuel to fight. Iwo Jima changed everything. The tiny volcanic island, barely 8 square miles of sulfur and ash, sat almost exactly midway between the Marianas and Japan. Its capture in February and March of 1945 was among the bloodiest operations of the Pacific War. More than 6,000 Marines died taking it. The strategic logic was simple. Iwo Jima would become a haven for damaged bombers and, crucially, a base for escort. Fighters. By late February, even as fighting continued in some corners of the island, P-51 Mustangs of the 7 Fighter Command began arriving. These aircraft were flown by pilots who had trained in the United States, many of whom had never seen combat. They were young, they were eager, and they were about to face an enemy that still had teeth. The Japanese pilots they would encounter were not the elite aviators of 1941. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces had suffered catastrophic losses in pilots and aircraft over the preceding years. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of June 1944 had obliterated what remained of Japan's carrier aviation. But attrition had not eliminated Japanese resistance. Homeland defense squadrons still operated capable aircraft, Zeros, Oscars, Jacks, and Georges, flown by a mix of veterans and hastily trained replacements. For American pilots arriving on Iwo Jima, the learning curve was vertical. They had to master formation flying over featureless ocean, navigate without landmarks, manage fuel with surgical precision, and engage an enemy who knew these skies intimately. The margin for error was measured in gallons and seconds. Into this crucible stepped young men who had never killed and never been shot at. Some would not survive their first mission. Others would return changed, carrying memories that would last a lifetime. And a few, a very few, would do something that defied every reasonable expectation. This is the story of one of those men. If this history matters to you, Tap like and subscribe. Before he was a fighter pilot, he was a farm boy who watched biplanes dust crops in the summer heat. The Midwest in the 1930s was a place of open skies and hard work, where machinery was understood through use rather than theory. Tractors broke down, engines were rebuilt. Hands learned the language of metal and grease long before they ever touched a throttle. The young man who would one day outrun 9 zeros grew up in that world of practical knowledge. He was not a prodigy. He was not wealthy. He had no family connections to the military or to aviation. What he had was an obsessive curiosity about how things moved through air. He built model aircraft from balsa wood and tissue paper, adjusting wing angles by fractions of inches, testing them in the fields behind his family's property. He read whatever aviation magazines he could find, studying photographs of pursuit planes and bombers, memorizing specifications that would have bored his classmates to sleep. When war came, to Europe in 1939, he was still a teenager. When Pearl Harbor pulled America into the conflict, he was barely old enough to enlist. He joined the Army Air Forces in 1943, driven by equal parts patriotism and the knowledge that this was his chance to fly. Pilot training in the United States during World War II was a mass production enterprise designed to turn civilians into combat aviators in a matter of months. Primary training taught basic flight. Basic training introduced military aircraft. Advanced training specialized pilots for fighters, bombers, or transports. The entire process could take less than a year. He moved through the system with quiet competence. Instructors noted his smoothness on the controls, his ability to anticipate rather than react. He was not the fastest or the most aggressive in his class, but he was consistent. He made few mistakes, and when he made them, he understood why. The P-51 Mustang was the aircraft that defined his advanced training. By 1944, the Mustang had established itself as the finest American fighter of the war. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, license-built by Packard, gave it speed and altitude performance that matched or exceeded anything in the German or Japanese inventory. Its range, with external tanks, was extraordinary. Its 650 caliber machine guns could shred aircraft, vehicles, and light fortifications alike. But the Mustang was also demanding. It had narrow landing gear that made ground handling tricky. Its fuel system required careful management. Its visibility, while excellent in some respects, had blind spots that could prove fatal in a dogfight. Pilots who flew carelessly died. He learned the Mustang's moods the way he had once learned a temperamental tractor. He understood its center of gravity, its stall characteristics, its tendency to yaw under power. He practiced emergency procedures until they became automatic. He flew formation until he could hold position with his eyes closed, sensing the lead aircraft through the subtle vibrations of disturbed air. By the time he received his orders for the Pacific, he had logged perhaps 200 hours in the P-51. By the standards of 1945, this was adequate. By the standards of combat, it was barely enough. He arrived on Iwo Jima in February, less than a week after the initial landings. The island was still contested in places. Artillery rumbled in the distance. The airfield was a construction zone of bulldozers and Seabees carved from volcanic ash that turned everything gray. The smell of sulfur hung in the air, mixing with aviation fuel and the distant stench of death. His squadron was assigned to the 21st Fighter Group, part of 7 Fighter Command. Their mission was bomber escort, accompanying B-29s to Japan and protecting them from Japanese interceptors. It was the longest fighter mission in the history of aerial warfare, a round trip of nearly 1,500 miles over open ocean. He had no illusions about what awaited him. Intelligence briefings made clear that Japanese pilots, though depleted in numbers, remained dangerous. The Zero, the A-6M that had once terrorized the Pacific, was still a formidable dogfighter at low and medium speeds. Japanese tactics emphasized teamwork and mutual support, and Japanese pilots, facing the destruction of their homeland, fought with desperation. He flew his first combat mission in late February. It was a long, cold, uneventful flight over endless blue water. No enemy aircraft appeared. The bombers dropped their loads on targets obscured by clouds. The fighters returned to Iwo Jima with full ammunition belts and empty drop tanks. His second mission was the same, and his third. The Japanese, it seemed, were conserving their strength, choosing when and where to fight. The American pilots grew restless. They had trained for combat. They craved the validation of facing an enemy. They did not yet understand that the absence of contact was a gift. On his fourth mission, the gift ran out. The morning of the mission began like all the others: pre-dawn darkness, cold powdered eggs, a briefing room thick with cigarette smoke and nervous energy. The target was a complex of airfields and industrial facilities near Tokyo. Intelligence expected heavy opposition. The Japanese had been reinforcing their home defense squadrons, and aerial reconnaissance had photographed new aircraft dispersed around the target area. The P-51 pilots would escort B-29s from the 73rd Bombardment Wing. The bombers would fly at altitude, somewhere around 25,000 feet. The fighters would weave around them, scanning for interceptors, ready to break off and engage. The mission duration was estimated at 7 hours, assuming no mechanical problems and no significant combat. He checked his aircraft with the attention of a surgeon preparing instruments. Drop tanks were secure. Ammunition belts were loaded and free of kinks. Control surfaces moved through their full range. The Merlin engine turned over with the characteristic Rolls-Royce smoothness that pilots came to love. Everything was nominal. Takeoff from Iwo Jima was an exercise in controlled chaos. The ash strip was short and rough. Crosswinds came off Mount Suribachi without warning. Fully loaded P-51s, heavy with fuel and ammunition, needed every foot of runway. He lifted off with feet to spare, gear coming up, the Mustang transitioning from ungainly ground machine to graceful airborne predator. The formation assembled over the island, then set course north-northwest toward Japan. The ocean below was vast and featureless, broken only by occasional whitecaps and the shadows of clouds. Pilots settled into the long monotony of cruise flight, checking instruments, managing fuel, fighting the cold that seeped into cockpits at altitude. Hours passed. Japan appeared on the horizon as a dark smudge, then resolved into mountains and coastline. The B-29s ahead began their bomb runs. Flak rose from below, black puffs that seemed almost lazy until one burst close enough to rock a bomber's wing. The P-51s spread out, hunting, and then contact. The first reports came from flights ahead of his position. Japanese fighters, rising to intercept, were engaging the bombers and their escorts. The radio crackled with clipped transmissions, calls of bogies, warnings of bandits at various clock positions, the terse acknowledgments of pilots entering combat. His flight leader banked toward the action, and he followed, throttle advancing, eyes scanning the sky. Combat at altitude was a confusing swirl of aircraft moving in 3 dimensions at speeds that made recognition difficult. Friend and foe looked similar at distance. Only position, behavior, and the distinctive silhouettes of different aircraft types offered clues. He saw his first Zero in the flesh, a small, almost delicate aircraft painted in mottled camouflage, banking hard to avoid a pursuing Mustang. It was faster than he had expected, more agile, and for a moment he understood why this aircraft had once ruled the Pacific. The engagement that followed was chaos. His flight scattered, each pilot responding to immediate threats. He found himself alone, separated from his wingman, with no friendly aircraft in sight. This was the nightmare scenario that instructors had warned about. Isolation in combat was death. He climbed, seeking altitude and energy, trying to regain situational awareness. The sky seemed empty for a moment. Then it was not. 9 zeros. He counted them in the space of a heartbeat, closing from multiple directions, their intentions unmistakable. They had spotted the lone American and smelled blood. The first instinct was to run. The P-51 was faster than the Zero in level flight and in a dive. If he could break contact and extend away, they might not catch him. But 9 aircraft meant 9 pairs of eyes, 9 sets of guns. Running in a straight line would give them easy deflection shots. And his fuel state, after hours of flight, was not unlimited. He had seconds to decide. Everything he had learned in training, every hour of practice, every briefing about Japanese tactics, compressed into a single crystalline moment of clarity. The Zero was dangerous at low speed and in turning fights. It could outturn almost any American fighter, and its pilots were trained to exploit this advantage. But the Zero had weaknesses too. It was lightly built, almost fragile by American standards. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks and minimal armor. And it bled energy badly in high-speed maneuvering. Once a Zero was slow, it took time to accelerate again. He chose to fight, not because he was brave, but because he understood the geometry. The first pass came from above and behind, the classic bounce. He broke hard, pulling the Mustang into a descending spiral that traded altitude for speed. The Zero that had initiated the attack overshot, its pilot unwilling or unable to follow the diving turn. He glimpsed it flash past, close enough to see the red circles on its wings. More Zeros were converging now, trying to coordinate their attacks. But coordination in a dogfight was difficult. Aircraft moving at different speeds, from different angles, risked collision. The Americans had learned to attack in pairs, covering each other. The Japanese favored different tactics, but those tactics assumed a more static target. He was not static. He was a continuous blur of motion, using every ounce of the Mustang's energy to stay ahead of each attack. He did not try to engage. He did not fire his guns. He simply refused to be where they expected him to be. The key was speed. The P-51 was at its best when moving fast, above 300 miles per hour, its controls crisp, its roll rate superior to the Zero. Below 200, it became sluggish, vulnerable. He kept his airspeed up, using the vertical dimension to manage energy, climbing and diving in a continuous roller coaster that the Zeros struggled to match. The attacks came in waves. A Zero would commit to an attack run, and he would brake at the last possible moment, forcing an overshoot. Another would try to cut him off in a turn, and he would reverse, using the Mustang's roll rate to snap onto a new heading before the Zero could adjust. Each maneuver bought seconds. Seconds became minutes. He was not winning. He was surviving, and with each passing moment, the arithmetic of combat shifted in his favor. The Zeros were burning fuel, too. Their pilots, focused on the kill, were making aggressive maneuvers that drained their tanks. The longer the fight continued, the more urgent their own fuel concerns became, and somewhere in that desperate calculus, something changed. He heard it on the radio, not the American frequencies he was supposed to monitor, but a bleed-through from Japanese communications. The voice was urgent, clipped, speaking words he could not understand, but whose tone was unmistakable. Years later, Intelligence analysts reviewing captured Japanese communications from that period would translate similar transmissions. The words varied, but the meaning was consistent. American pilots who employed high-speed evasive tactics, refusing to be drawn into turning fights, were described with a mix of frustration and respect. Some transmissions included what amounted to warnings. The American was too fast, the attack was failing, break off. Whether the specific transmission he heard that day contained those words cannot be verified with certainty. What is certain is that the attack began to falter. One zero, then another, peeled away. The formation that had seemed so overwhelming began to thin. The hunters were becoming uncertain. He did not know why they were leaving. He only knew they were. And in the arithmetic of survival, that was everything. The last zero made one final pass, and then it too was gone, banking away toward the Japanese coastline. He was alone in the sky, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the Merlin's steady roar. His hands, locked on the stick and throttle, were trembling. He checked his instruments. Fuel was lower than he had hoped, but higher than he had feared. Ammunition remained. He had fired less than 50 rounds in the entire engagement, brief bursts at targets of opportunity that had crossed his gun sight. His aircraft appeared undamaged. No warning lights, no vibrations. The Mustang had performed exactly as advertised. The route home was etched in his memory. Course 170 magnetic. Descend to economical cruise altitude. Lean the mixture. Watch for friendly aircraft. Watch for carriers that might offer emergency landing if fuel ran short. The Pacific was vast and unforgiving, but he had the training, the fuel, and the aircraft to make it back. The flight to Iwo Jima took nearly 3 hours. He was alone for most of it, gradually rejoining with other returning P-51s as the scattered formation reassembled. No one spoke of what had happened over the target. The radio was quiet, reserved for navigation calls and fuel state reports. He landed at Iwo Jima as the sun was setting, the volcanic ash strip glowing orange in the dying light. The touchdown was smooth, the rollout uneventful. He taxied to his revetment, shut down the engine, and sat for a long moment in the sudden silence. The ground crew approached, ready to begin the post-flight inspection. He climbed out slowly, legs stiff from hours in the cramped cockpit. His crew chief asked if there was any damage to report. He told him no. The debriefing that followed was standard procedure. Intelligence officers collected details about enemy aircraft encountered, tactics observed, weapons expended. He described the engagement as accurately as he could, the number of enemy aircraft, their approach vectors, his evasive maneuvers. He did not exaggerate. He did not claim kills he could not confirm. He stated, simply, that he had been engaged by approximately 9 Japanese fighters and had evaded them. The intelligence officers noted his account without apparent surprise. Such engagements were not unknown. American pilots who maintained speed and avoided turning fights frequently survived against numerically superior opponents. The Zero, for all its agility, could not catch a Mustang that refused to slow down. But among the pilots who heard his story that night, there was something like awe. 9 zeros. Alone. A pilot with fewer than 10 combat missions. The arithmetic did not seem to add up. One of the older pilots, a captain with extensive combat experience, sought him out after the debriefing. The captain had been flying fighters since 1942. He had seen the war from North Africa to Italy to the Pacific. He understood what the young pilot had accomplished. The captain explained that most men, faced with 9 enemy aircraft, would have panicked. They would have tried to fight on Japanese terms, turning and burning until the Zeros whittled them down. Or they would have run in a straight line, making themselves easy targets. Either choice was fatal. What the young pilot had done was different. He had recognized in the space of seconds that his only advantage was speed and energy. He had refused to give those up. Every maneuver, every brake, every reversal had been designed to maintain the Mustang's edge while forcing the Zeros to expend theirs. It was not instinct. It was not luck. It was the application under unimaginable pressure of principles that many pilots learned but few could execute. The captain asked him how he had known what to do. He thought about the question for a long moment. Then he said that he had not known, not really. He had simply done what seemed logical in the moment. The Zeros could turn better. He could go faster, so he went faster. Again and again, until they gave up. It was the kind of answer that revealed more than it concealed. He had internalized his training so completely that it had become automatic. He had not needed to think, because thinking would have been too slow. His hands and feet had moved ahead of his conscious mind, translating years of preparation into seconds of survival. The captain nodded slowly. Then he told him something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He said that combat revealed character. It stripped away everything a man told himself and left only what was real. Some men discovered courage they never knew they had. Others discovered fear they could not overcome. A few, a very few, discovered something rarer still. They discovered competence so deep it became grace. The encounter over Tokyo was not an isolated incident. In the weeks and months that followed, American pilots would engage Japanese aircraft in hundreds of individual combats. The patterns that emerged from these engagements reshaped tactical doctrine and, ultimately, the course of the Pacific Air War. The fundamental lesson was one that the young pilot had demonstrated under fire. The P-51's advantage lay in energy management, not maneuverability. American pilots who tried to dogfight Japanese aircraft on their terms, low and slow in turning engagements, often lost. Those who maintained speed, used the vertical dimension, and refused to be drawn into close turning battles, survived and frequently prevailed. This was not a new insight. Aviation tacticians had understood energy fighting since the First World War. But institutional memory was short, and each new generation of pilots had to learn the lessons anew. The experiences of men like the young pilot who had escaped 9 Zeros became part of the oral tradition that was passed from veteran to replacement, flight by flight, mission by mission. Statistical analysis conducted after the war would confirm what pilots already knew. P-51 loss rates in Pacific operations were significantly lower than those of other fighter types, and engagements where American pilots maintained high speed showed dramatically higher survival rates than those where they allowed speed to bleed off. The Mustang was not merely a good aircraft, it was a system that, properly employed, fundamentally altered the arithmetic of aerial combat. The broader impact of these escort missions was equally significant. Japanese interception of B-29 raids, already constrained by fuel shortages and pilot losses, became increasingly ineffective as American fighters ranged over the home islands. By spring of 1945, Japanese fighter opposition to daylight raids had declined precipitously. The skies over Japan were becoming American. This superiority enabled the devastating firebombing campaign that would destroy dozens of Japanese cities in the final months of the war. It supported naval operations, ground campaigns, and the eventual atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The strategic consequences of the fighter campaign were incalculable, but strategic consequences are abstractions. What mattered to the men who flew the missions was something more immediate. They were coming home. Survival rates for P-51 pilots on escort missions were among the highest of any American fighter unit in any theater. Losses occurred. Mechanical failures, fuel exhaustion, lucky shots by Japanese gunners, the simple mathematics of probability that meant some aircraft would always fail to return. But the ratio of missions flown to aircraft lost was remarkably favorable. The young pilot who had escaped 9 zeros flew dozens more missions before the war ended. He encountered Japanese fighters on several subsequent occasions, though never again in such numbers. His technique remained consistent: maintain speed, use the vertical, refuse the turning fight. He was never shot down. His story was not unique. Across the Pacific, hundreds of American pilots applied similar principles with similar results, but his encounter, with its dramatic disparity in numbers and its clear demonstration of tactical discipline, became one of the examples cited in post-war analyses of fighter effectiveness. Intelligence assessments that examined captured Japanese documents and prisoner interrogations confirmed what the intercepted radio transmissions had suggested. Japanese pilots, especially those with limited experience, found high-speed American fighters extremely difficult to engage. Orders to break off attacks on targets that refused to be drawn into turning fights were common. The phrase that would later be translated, "too fast, abort, disengage," appeared in various forms across multiple accounts. The Japanese aviation establishment, facing the twin catastrophes of fuel shortage and pilot attrition, never developed effective counter-tactics. They could not manufacture more fuel. They could not accelerate pilot training without sacrificing quality. And they could not change the fundamental physics that gave fast, high-powered American fighters the edge in energy combat. By the time the war ended, Japanese aviation had been reduced to a shadow of its former capability. The once proud Zero, the aircraft that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor and ruled the Pacific skies for 18 months, had become an anachronism, outclassed, outpaced, and outfought by a new generation of American aircraft and the pilots who flew them. He came home in late 1945, one of millions of young men returning from the Pacific and European theaters. He did not speak much about the war. When asked, he would acknowledge that he had been a fighter pilot, that he had flown out of Iwo Jima, that he had seen combat. But he did not tell stories. He did not seek recognition. He returned to the Midwest, to the landscape of fields and open skies that had shaped his childhood. He married, had children, built a life in the same patient, methodical way he had once built model aircraft. He worked with machinery, understanding engines and systems with the same intuitive grasp that had served him in the cockpit. Decades passed. The war receded into history. New conflicts arose: Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War's endless shadowboxing. The P-51 Mustang, once the pinnacle of fighter design, became a museum piece, preserved at air shows and restoration hangars. The men who had flown them grew old. In his later years, when interviewers occasionally sought him out for oral history projects, he would speak about the war with a reflective detachment. He was careful with facts, precise about dates and locations, reluctant to claim more than he knew with certainty. He did not embellish. When asked about the encounter with 9 zeros, he would describe it much as he had described it in the debriefing decades before: the numbers, the geometry, the decision to maintain speed. He did not characterize it as heroic. He called it logical. But sometimes, late in conversations, he would offer something more. He would speak about the feeling of being utterly alone, surrounded by enemies, with no one to help and nowhere to hide. He would describe the strange calm that had descended when he realized that panic was not an option, that survival required clarity. He said that the moment had taught him something he carried for the rest of his life. When everything was stripped away, the training, the doctrine, the institutional support, what remained was a choice. He could surrender to fear, or he could act. There was no middle ground. He had chosen to act, not because he was braver than other men, but because action was the only alternative to death. And in that choice, in that simple refusal to accept the odds as final, he had discovered something about himself. He discovered that competence, deeply ingrained, could function even when the conscious mind was overwhelmed. He discovered that preparation mattered more than talent, that the hours of practice and study were not wasted, but were instead the foundation on which survival was built. He discovered that machines, properly understood and properly employed, extended human capability in ways that could seem almost miraculous. And he discovered that the margin between life and death was often narrower than anyone wanted to admit. A fraction of a second, a few degrees of deflection, a decision made in the space of a heartbeat. The young men who had hunted him that day, the Japanese pilots in their Zeros, were gone now, too. Some had died in the war, claimed by American guns or fuel exhaustion or the atomic fire that ended the conflict. Others had survived, returning to a defeated nation, carrying their own memories of desperate battles in skies that no longer existed except in memory. He bore them no malice. They had done their duty as he had done his. They had fought for their country as he had fought for his. The geometry of the war had made them enemies, but that geometry was transient. What remained across the decades was a shared understanding of what it meant to fly in combat, to face death in the bright, clear air, to survive through skill and luck, and the relentless will to live. On the day he died, peacefully, surrounded by family, the sky outside his window was clear and blue. It was the kind of sky he had known his whole life, the kind of sky that had called him upward as a boy watching biplanes, the kind of sky that had tried to kill him over Tokyo. He looked at that sky one last time, and perhaps, in his final moments, he remembered the cold clarity of the cockpit, the Merlin's steady roar, the Zeros wheeling around him, the choice that had saved his life, the radio call that might have come in those final moments of the engagement would become legend in the retelling. Whether the exact words were ever spoken, whether Japanese pilots actually transmitted the phrase that would later be translated as abort, "He is too fast," cannot be proven with absolute certainty. The fog of war obscures even the clearest memories. But what is certain is this: a young man with barely 6 months of training faced impossible odds and prevailed. He did not prevail through superior firepower or numerical advantage or divine intervention. He prevailed through the application of principles he had learned so thoroughly that they had become part of him. In the end, that was his legacy, not the number of aircraft he might have damaged or destroyed, not the medals or the citations or the statistics. His legacy was the demonstration, in the most extreme conditions imaginable, that preparation matters, that discipline matters, that the choice to act when every instinct screams to freeze is the difference between those who survive and those who do not. The Pacific War produced many heroes, many stories of courage and sacrifice and loss. Most of those stories have been forgotten, lost to time and the simple reality that there were too many to remember. But some stories endure. They endure because they capture something essential about the human capacity to transcend circumstance, to find clarity in chaos, to refuse the verdict of probability. His story was one of those. They said he was too fast to kill. What they meant was that he refused to die. And in that refusal, in that single crystalline decision made in the space of a heartbeat, he wrote his name into the permanent record of what human beings are, capable of when everything is on the line. Speed is life. He knew it. He lived it. And because he did, he came home.